Cafe Luna, Seasons of Adventure, Volume 1, by Lux Lucerne. Chapter 9. The day faded to evening, the gray light of the clouded sky growing darker. Snow continued to fall and swirl, adorning the streets in white. Lunatya slept on the bed, her chest slowly rising and falling as she breathed, though her fluffy companion was no longer slumbering next to her. Instead, he was running around the room with the pitter-patter of his soft paws. Around and around he went, jumping from the desk to the bed, to the boxes and shelves, and back again. His tail trailed behind him as he scurried and made small jumps over this and that. His course would be interrupted when something caught his attention, and he would investigate it with his paws. Luffy also liked to sit by the window, making a stop there in his adventure around the room each loop. He would reach up his paws to the ledge of the window from the desk, making a small hop up. Rustling behind the curtain, he would find a spot that he liked, then watch the snowfall, glistening in the light of the street lamps. After, he would climb out the other way onto the nightstand, continuing his journey. From time to time, Luffy would look at Lunatya, still sleeping on the bed. He would check on her, sitting next to her for a moment, then would continue on his route, traversing the pillow and blanket mountains around her along the edge of the bed. Though the little cat could only walk around the room so much before wanting to go out. He hopped onto the bed and climbed onto her, his soft paws making slight indents on her plump belly. He tilted his head, looking at her. "Meow," said Luffy. Lunatya was still fast asleep, however. Little Fluffy moved his nose closer to hers, and with a little meow, licked it. This was enough to make her stir, and she stroked his back. What is it, Luffy?" Lunatya mumbled. "I want to sleep a little longer." "Meow," cried Luffy. Luffy determined that Lunatya was not going to get up at the moment, so he decided to continue on his adventure around the room. His great furry agility, he leapt to the nightstand, bouncing off of Lunatya's belly. "Oof, so heavy. Oh my gosh," muttered Lunatya. Luffy landed on the nightstand with his soft paws, making a soft poont sound. He continued to scurry around the room, letting out the occasional meow. Luffy wanted to go out, though he didn't know what to do, being a simple fluffy cat. He pawed at the door, though no matter what he did, it would not move out of the way. He pawed at the hinges, he pawed at the knob, and he even poked his paw under the door, but no matter what he did, he couldn't get through. Luffy didn't know what to do. So as he went back to wandering around the room, letting out pitiful meows, he discovered something of great interest. The cloth wardrobe situated next to the end of Lunatya's bed was very nice to sit on top of, being soft and elevated. Luffy also found the inside to be pleasing to his cat aesthetics, being enclosed with plenty of nooks filled with soft clothing to sit on. But most interesting of all was the feel of cloth on his paws, which was also particularly pleasing to scratch. Luffy was quick to indulge in scratching the wardrobe siding, just discovering the joys of attacking furniture. The wardrobe trembled as the cat attacked it, and it even made a pleasant jingling sound as some chimes stored inside the wardrobe began to sway. The plucking of claws on fabric and the ringing sound of chimes, to some it would be nerve-wracking and stress-inducing, though to Luffy it was quite relaxing. And with all this noise being made, Lunatya awoke with a fright. "No, no, no! What are you doing, Luffy?" cried Lunatya. "No attack! No attack!" Lunatya sprung out of bed and rushed to Luffy's side, halting his attack on the wardrobe. She plucked the furry critter out of her wardrobe and placed him on the floor. Looking inside, she was relieved to find it still intact. Sigh. Guess nap time is over. I'll have to get you something to scratch next time I go out, Luffy, Lunatya said with a pout. You be a good boy and don't attack the furniture, okay? Lunatya waved her finger at him with a stern look. Luffy returned it with a confused head tilt. Lunatya's frustration was swept away, with his big, pitiful eyes looking up at her. So Luffy turned around and made his way to the door, letting out an expectant cry. Meow, he said pitifully. Do you want to go out, Luffy? Lunatya asked, tilting her head. It's time to start cooking anyway. Let's go downstairs, little Fluffy. Lunatya walked over to the door and opened it. Luffy scampered out and turned around, waiting for her. The door being opened, the cogs in Luffy's simple mind began to turn. From this experience, he learned that not only was attacking the wardrobe fun to do, but was also very effective in waking up Lunatya, so he could be let out. From henceforth, the defenseless wardrobe would be attacked by the mighty cat whenever Lunatya was not prompt to meet his desires of leaving the room. For the time being, Lunatya led the rambunctious cat downstairs to the kitchen. Luffy was quick to start exploring the kitchen, while Lunatya gathered all the ingredients she needed for tonight's dinner. She pulled out the ground beef from the refrigerator, careful to keep a certain hungry critter from attacking it. Along with Luffy's special carrot, she placed the beef and root vegetables on the counter. She placed a hand on her chin, looking the ingredients over and envisioning the process of what needed to be done. The veggies need to be peeled, the beef formed into meatballs then browned, and a rich base prepared for them to simmer in. For Luffy, the meatballs would be baked and his special carrot steamed. Nadia nodded, forming the picture to be painted in her mind, and brought out some more ingredients. The bounty of root vegetables were joined by some onions and a tomato, while a pot of beef broth was set to warm. With everything in its place, Lunatya filled a bowl with cool water, placing it on the counter, ready to stop the peeled vegetables from browning. She brought out the vegetable peeler and picked up a carrot. Luffy, I'm peeling the carrots now. Do you want to watch? Called Lunatya. Lunatya waved the carrot in his direction. The fluffy shadow interrupted, walking over any surface he could reach, and hopped onto a chair next to the counter. Meow, chirped Luffy. Luffy perked up his ears and was waving his tail from side to side as it dangled over the edge of the chair. Lunatya began to peel the carrots, making a rhythmic scraping sound with each stroke of the peeler. This served as a steady musical beat as Lunatya hummed a cheerful song softly. It wasn't any song in particular, but a song from her heart. Luffy watched, moving his head from side to side, following the motion of Lunatya's hand. Lunatya placed the first carrot into the bowl of water. I'll peel your special carrot next, Luffy, said Lunatya. That way you can play with it while I finish the rest of the prep. Lunatya picked up Luffy's special carrot, which was placed apart from the others. She held it out to him, and he jumped up on the counter, giving it a sniff. Luffy pawed at it, stroking it like how Lunatya peeled the other carrot. Meow, meow! Good job, Luffy, Lunatya cheered. Such a helpful Fluffy. Wah! Let's peel your special carrot. Meow! Cried Luffy with excitement. Lunatya pulled the carrot back close to her as Luffy sat on the edge of the counter, watching. Lunatya pulled the peeler across the carrot, making a smooth scraping sound. Luffy reached out and pawed the strip of carrot skin hanging from the edge, causing it to fall into the bin. Ah, good job, Luffy, said Lunatya, bouncing with joy. Meow, chirped Luffy, looking at his successful work. Lunatya peeled another strip of carrot, but this time picked it up and motioned to toss it to Luffy. Luffy nodded his head, following the motion of Lunatya's hand. Are you ready, Luffy? Here it comes, said Lunatya. Lunatya tossed the strip of carrot towards Luffy, and with one paw, Luffy whacked it out of the air into the bin. Luffy let out a cry of victory and excitement. Meow, meow, cried Luffy. Luffy, attack! Meow, meow. Very good job, Luffy, cheered Lunatya. You're a very good kitty. Lunatya peeled another strip and tossed it towards Luffy. Though this time, Luffy missed. He swiped with his paw, but it did not connect, and the strip of carrot landed on his face. Luffy was confused by this, pulling back his head and wobbling, on the verge of tipping over. He rubbed both his paws on his face, causing it to fall to the counter. "Meow," said Luffy, tilting his head. "Oh my god, such a silly fluffy," said Lunatya, chuckling. Luffy pawed at the strip of carrot and gave it a sniff, before pushing it over the edge and watching it fall into the bin. Lunatya patted him on the top of his head and smiled. "This is a lot more fun than I would have expected. Such a particular cat," said Lunatya, letting out a breath. "I think I love you very much, Luffy." Luffy purred and rubbed his head into her hand. His purring was a simple, soft rumbling sound, but it was filled with affection and joy. Pure sincerity that reached the soul, bringing warmth and tranquility to her discordant heart. "It's refreshing to have the company of someone so open and sincere. There's lots of people who aren't as honest about their emotions as you are, Luffy," she whispered, stroking his soft fur. "I can always feel it in my heart when something isn't quite right, and it makes me anxious sometimes. Maybe that's why I like you so much. You're very simple and pure, even though you're a bit mischievous sometimes." Lunatya took a moment for herself, reflecting on everything that's been happening. Part of her shivered and trembled, with so many things unclear and uncertain, as if obscured by a blizzard. She picked up Luffy and held him tight, steadying herself. "I hope my father is all right, wherever he is. He's really big and strong, but I still worry sometimes. And with him going missing," Lunatya whispered, choking on her words, "that's never happened before." Luffy looked up at her with his big round eyes, then nuzzled his head against her. "I miss Zeph too. It was always so fun to go out on adventures with him while he was training here. Now that I haven't seen him in a long while, I realized how much I really like him," she said, a small smile spreading across her face, thinking of his calming aura. He always had a gentle air around him, like an enveloping spring breeze. He looks so aloof and cool on the outside, but he's one of the most kind-hearted people I've met. He's shy, but when someone is in need, he'd rush to their aid with his gallant determination in his eye. When he comes back, we can go on adventures like we used to, and you can come and be our little support kitty, carrying around some potions in a little baggie." Lunatya looked down at Luffy, holding him close to her chest and stroking his soft fur. Luffy tilted his head and twitched his ears. "Meow," Luffy said softly. He rubbed his face on her chest, trying to comfort her. "I certainly feel your support now, even though I just brought you home," he whispered to Luffy. "I can tell you're a very nice kitty, and it's comforting having your presence always around, even though it hasn't been for long." He took a deep breath and then put Luffy back down on the counter. "Let's get back to preparing dinner," she said with a resolute nod. "I think a hot meal with company would be really great right about now." "Meow," responded Luffy. Luffy perched himself on the edge of the counter again, whacking the slices of carrots that flew in his direction into the bin. Soon enough, his special carrot was peeled, and Lunatya gave it to him to play with. He pawed at it, rolled it around, and rubbed his face on it. Back and forth from one side of the counter to the other, he walked with his carrot and rolled it around. Meanwhile, Lunatya focused on peeling the rest of the vegetables, filling the bowl of water with the bright orange of carrots and sweet potatoes. Lunatya walked over to the sink and started to wash her hands. Luffy wondered where she was going and hopped over to the other counter, landing with a soft poomph. "Do you want to wash your paws too, Luffy?" she asked. Luffy motioned his paws towards the water, waving at it. Come here, Luffy. I'll help you, said Lunatya coaxingly. Lunatya put one of her arms around him and held each of his paws. One at a time she held them under the faucet and gave them a quick cleaning. Luffy tilted his head between the faucet and Lunatya each time as she washed his paws. Boop, boop. A little scrub and you're all clean now, she cheered. With a small cloth she dried her hands, then Luffy's paws. Next we need to cut the vegetables, said Lunatya, placing Luffy back on his chair. I'll cut your special carrot first. Lunatya laid the damp cloth on the counter and placed a cutting board on top of it, preventing it from slipping. Luffy curled himself into a loaf, watching Lunatya go about her cooking. She drew her knife, still sheathed on her belt, and pulled it along a honing steel, making a rhythmic scraping sound. Luffy's head turned back and forth, following Lunatya's motions. This is for realigning the edge on my knife, Luffy. Gotta make sure it's in good condition, especially for these sweet potatoes, explained to Lunatya. If there are any nicks in the edge, the knife will get stuck there while cutting, and it makes it harder to control. I won't want there to be any accidents, especially with you around. Now you stay there and watch where it's safe. Starting with Luffy's carrot, she pinched her knife along its spine and curled her fingers against the flat, holding the carrot with her fingertips. In one smooth stroke, she pushed the knife through the carrot, making a crisp snap as the knife tapped the cutting board below. Pinch the knife just above the handle with your thumb and pointer finger. This grip gives you lots of control, so you can guide the knife where you need to. And with your other hand, you curl your fingers so the top of your fingers is against the flat of the knife, and the tips don't have a chance to slip under it, continued Lunatya. Do you like the sound it makes when I cut the carrots, Luffy? My knife is pretty sharp, so there isn't too much banging on the board. Lunatya continued to cut the carrot, pushing the carrot along with her offhand, while she made rhythmic cuts with the knife. Luffy bobbed his head, watching the knife move up and down, with his ears twitching when there was a satisfying vegetable crunch. Once Luffy's carrot was sliced, Lunatya picked up the cutting board and scraped the slices into a separate pot with the back of her knife. She placed the cutting board back down and started slicing the rest of the carrots, while Luffy pawed and mixed the slices in the pot. The rest of the carrot slices were placed into another bowl, ready to put into the stew later on. Next we need to cut the sweet potatoes, Luffy, said Lunatya. A lot of people don't have very sharp knives, and sweet potatoes can be difficult to cut, making it a bit dangerous. Lunatya placed the first sweet potato on the board and laid the edge of her knife on top, rocking the vegetable from side to side. Luffy wobbled his head from side to side, watching the unstable vegetable wibble and wobble. Sweet potatoes aren't stable either, so there's a big chance you could slip if you're not careful, Lunatya said, waving a finger in the air, looking at Luffy. To make it safer, we cut down the middle first, so we have a flat surface to work with. Lunatya cupped her hands over the spine of the knife, holding it down to the sweet potato. With one smooth push cut, she sliced it lengthwise, then placed the two halves flat side down. There we go. Now it won't move around so much when we go to cut it, and we can slice it more easily, she said, continuing her instruction. I'll slice them about the same size of the carrots so they cook evenly, and then we'll put them back into the cold water so they won't brown from the air. Luffy finished investigating his carrot slices and went back to loafing on the counter, watching Lunatya go about her prep and listening to her talk. Luffy didn't quite understand what she was saying, but he certainly liked to watch what she was doing. He liked it very much to be involved. One by one, the sweet potatoes were cut, following the well-practiced method. Lunatya hummed a little song, accompanied by the occasional clap of the cutting board, enjoying Luffy's company with his occasional chirp. With one final sploosh, the last of the sweet potatoes was plopped into the bowl of water. We're all done with the vegetables, Luffy, jeered Lunatya. Now for the meatballs. With a little boop on Luffy's nose, Lunatya moved to another part of the counter and put the ground beef she had set out into a bowl. She laid out a pair of trays, a small bowl of flour onto the counter. Luffy sat next to the bowl of meat, sniffing and smacking his lips. Cracked a couple eggs into the bowl along with a sprinkle of salt, then mixed and combined it with her hands. Taking a scoop, she rolled it into a ball and tossed it into the bowl of flour. With a quick tumble and shake, it was dusted with flour and placed onto the first tray. Luffy gave it a sniff before sitting back down to watch Lunatya work. His tail waved from side to side, as he watched with excitement. As Lunatya tossed the meatballs and flour one by one, Luffy's curiosity was piqued, and he pawed at the bowl of flour. He sat down right next to it and peered into the bowl, watching Lunatya roll the meatballs back and forth. "Do you want to help, Luffy? I'll go get another bowl of flour and you can roll your own." "Such a nice Fluffy, wanting to do the helping, hee," said Lunatya, giggling. "Meow," chirped Luffy in reply. After rinsing her hands, she filled another bowl of flour and placed it in front of Luffy. He gave it a sniff, then placed a paw in it, digging a little trench. "Meow," said Luffy. A proud look spread across his face. He looked at Lunatya, waiting for his first meatball, while waving his tail back and forth with excitement. Lunatya took another scoop and patted it into a rough ball, and tossed it into Luffy's bowl. He traced it with his eyes, and it landed into the flour with a soft poof. Luffy stuck his head in the bowl, giving it a sniff, and pawed some flour onto it, with a slight digging motion. Luffy lifted up his paw out of the bowl and held it on the edge of the bowl. "Meow," cheered Luffy excitedly. "Ah, you did a very good job, Luffy," said Lunatya, clapping with joy. "You can roll it around, too, to make sure it's all coated. See?" Lunatya took Luffy's soft paw and guided him to push the meatball around in the bowl. "Easy, isn't it? Now you try," she said, tilting her head to the side and smiling. Lunatya let go of his paw, and Luffy pawed the meatball around in the flour. With gentle little taps, it went from one side, then to the other, as Luffy watched it, turning his head from side to side. "Very good job. Luffy, do the learning. Wow, wow," Lunatya cheered. "Meow, meow," responded Luffy, excited as well. Luffy placed his dirty paw on the side of the bowl as he looked up at Lunatya. His fluffy tail went swish, 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 as he waited for his next meatball. Lunatya took Luffy's first meatball out of the bowl of flour and placed it down on a separate baking sheet. "I'll make you lots of meatballs so you can have them as a snack later, Luffy," said Lunatya. Lunatya plopped another meatball to be coated into Luffy's bowl. He was quick to paw flour on it and roll it around. Then she would form another meatball, roll it in flour herself, put it on the other tray. By then, Luffy would finish with his meatball and let out another little mew, and she would give him another to work with. Back and forth, one piece at a time, each tray was filled with meatballs. One tray for the people, one tray for a Mr. Cat. Oh, in Lunatia's mind, Luffy was people too. Full of personality and curiosity, with emotions as open as a book. He was perhaps more people than other people she had encountered in her life. In her eyes, even after only knowing him for a short time, Luffy was a wonderful ball of fluff, who was filled with kindness and supported her in his own fluffy way. He's a silly little simpleton cat, though he always tries his best, and sometimes he even has a moment of brilliance. With the meatballs all prepped to be cooked, Luffy was unsure what to do next. He lifted his paw and almost put it on the table, though hesitated and pulled it back. With his big round eyes, he looked around and wasn't sure where to put it. He didn't want to lick it, and he didn't want to put it on the table. So instead, he put it back onto the edge of the bowl of flour and let out a pitiful sound. "Meow!" he cried like a baby in need, wanting assistance to clean his paw. "Goodness, you can be quite the clean cat," said Lunatya. "That's very good. No running around leaving paw prints everywhere. You stay there, Luffy. I'll come help you in just a moment." Lunatya scurried to the sink and gave her hands a quick wash, and dried them on a nearby towel. With a delicate touch, she picked up Luffy from under his arms and carried him to the sink, plonking him down beside it. Luffy paddled his little paws under the faucet, anticipating the water. He lowered his head and looked at the distinct lack of water. Lunatya laughed, then turned the faucet on, letting Luffy paw at the water for a moment. Then she held a paw in each hand, feeling the soft pads. "Let's get your paws nice and clean, so you can run around wherever you like." Put the paw under the water, and then a little scrub. Choo choo choo, sang Lunatya with cheer. She held Luffy's dirty paw under the faucet, massaging it with care to get all the gunk and flour off of it. She gave his other paw a quick rinse and rubbed both his paws together. Ta-da! All clean, cheered Lunatya. After I dry off your little paws, you can go play while I start cooking. Placed one of his paws in a kitchen towel and gave it a quick rub. Poof! It was all dry and fluffy. Then she tried the next. Poof! Luffy's paws were dry and ready for walking around on everything he could. After a pat on the head, Luffy was ready to go on his next adventure exploring the kitchen. With a squint of his eyes and a shake of his rear, he leapt down from the counter onto the floor and was on his way. Tail held high and feet trotting like a horse, he pathed his way around the kitchen with great determination. His head was lowered to his shoulders and his ears perked up as he explored the many mysteries of the kitchen. His little paws could walk on it. He walked on it. He would reach it with a single fluffy bound. He would jump on it. All the mysteries of the kitchen were to be unveiled, for Luffy was full of energy and was ready to run around. With the sound of pattering paws across the kitchen and the occasional meow, Lunatya flicked the stove on and brought the tray of meatballs over. He placed the pot to heat and went to wash the dirty dishes. The flow of water and the soft clink of kitchenware. Lunatya scrubbed the dishes she had used while preparing dinner. With careful attention she wiped each one down, not missing a spot. Warm water enveloped her hands, bubbles glittering in the light, and the smell of fresh soap wafted from the sink. Then she would place each dish to the side on a towel to dry, making soft clinks, clunks, and thumps. The noises had attracted a particular cat who was filled with curiosity and energy. Luffy jumped up on the counter to see what Lunatya was doing. No, he did not walk around the sink, nor did he jump back down onto the floor. Instead, he walked over Lunatya's arms, crossing right in front of her, then made his way to the rest of the kitchen. His fluffy tail brushed up against Lunatya's face as he scampered by, high-stepping over her arms as if he was swimming. Lunatya laughed with a bright smile on her face. "It tickles! What are you doing, Luffy?" cried Lunatya. "My goodness!" "Meow, meow," said Luffy, zooming along. After crossing over Lunatya's arms, Luffy jumped down from the counter onto a bin and to the floor with great feline agility. Then after a brief stroll around the rest of the kitchen, the sound of mews and soft paws jumping around, he would come by to inspect the progress Lunatya was making. He walked over her arms each time, tickling her face with his tail, though soon enough the sound of pattering paws had stopped, and the cries of a pitiful but energetic cat quieted. The dishes were finished, but where was the little Fluffy to be found? "Luffy? Where did you go?" called Lunatya. Lunatya dried her hands on a towel as she started pacing around the kitchen. There was no sign of the energetic cat that was running laps around the kitchen just a few minutes ago. A swell of anxiety started to build up. Where did that little sneaky cat go? Lunatya looked up on the shelves around the room. Luffy was nowhere to be seen. She made her way to the other side of the kitchen to turn down the fire of the stove while she looked for Luffy. As she rounded the island in the middle of the kitchen, her heart stopped. Luffy laid in the middle of the aisle, right next to the stove. He was on his side with his paws out and he didn't move. Lunatya clenched her hand to her chest and walked over with light steps. "Luffy? Are you okay, Luffy?" she whispered, voice trembling. As she stepped closer, Luffy moved. He turned his head, looking over his shoulder with heavy, squinted eyes. He let out a big yawn and then rested his head back down, waving his tail along the floor. "Goodness, don't scare me like that," said Lunatya, letting out a breath. Lunatya walked over to the stove and turned down the fire. then knelt down next to Luffy. She ran her hand along his side, then massaged him between his ears. Luffy purred and nuzzled against her hand. Must really like it here, Luffy. I don't think I've ever seen a cat lay on their side like that before, she whispered softly. Do you feel safe and relaxed? Rested an elbow on her knee and her chin on her palm. Luffy had his paws curled up against him as he rubbed his head into Lunatya's hand. Lunatya moved the tips of her fingers back and forth through his soft fur, feeling it glide around them, closing them together, bunching his fur into a tuft, and spreading it out again. Luffy tilted his head back and looked up at her. His eyelids were heavy and his face relaxed. His eyes fluttered shut as he slow blinked at her, showing his trust. Lunatya clutched her hand to her chest. How did such a nice cat end up in my kitchen? I can't believe it. My goodness. I love you very much, Luffy, said Lunatya, resting her cheek on her hand. How about I go get your bed? You stay right there, little Fluffy. The quiet rumble of his purring continued, even after she stopped petting him. He rested his head back down and stretched out his paws, forming somewhat of a furry crescent. Lunatya moved around him with a soft step and started to make her way upstairs. The sound of her leaving roused Luffy as he lifted up his tired head with squinted eyes. Meow, said Luffy softly. I'll be right back. You rest there, replied Lunatya. Luffy closed his eyes again and laid his head back down, quite content to simply lay on the kitchen floor all spread out. Lunatya scurried to her room and picked up Luffy's basket. By the time she returned to the kitchen, Luffy shifted more into a ball shape, with his front paws curled up against him, almost touching his feet. His tail wiggled from side to side as he heard Lunatya coming back. Lunatya approached Luffy with mindful steps, careful not to disturb him. He placed the basket on the ground next to him and unfolded the towel, making an opening. Come on, little Fluffy, let's get you tucked in, she whispered. You can rest in your bed while I cook up dinner. Lunatya picked him up from under his arms, and Luffy elongated as he was raised. He let out a tired meow, then a big yawn. His eyes still half open. Lunatya laid him down into the basket, like a delicate loaf of bread, fresh baked. This pleased Luffy, and the tip of his tail wiggled as it hung outside the basket. Lunatya scooped up his tail, letting the soft fur flow over her fingers as she tucked it into the basket, laying it along the edges. With one fold then another, she wrapped him with the towels and then closed the curtain on top, leaving a crack open for Luffy to watch her cook. With a firm and careful heft, she raised up the heavy basket filled with a precious loaf, placing it on the counter in view of the stove. Good night, Luffy. I love you, she whispered, peering into the basket. Dinner will be ready in a little while, and we'll eat when our guest arrives. After tucking in the little Fluffy that wasn't so little, Lunatya set her attention back on the stove, turning the fire back up. With a flick of her thumb, she drew her wand and twirled it into her hand. After a tap of her finger, a single drop formed on the tip of the wand and fell onto the pan. Turned to steam in but a moment. Lunatya twirled her wand back into her belt, content with the temperature of the pan. With a pour of oil, she laid the meatballs into the pot, one by one. Each of them sizzled as it touched the oil and began to fry. The crackling of hot oil continued as the pot was filled and the meatballs browned. The air took on a hot, savory smell, the meat turning to a rich, crispy brown. The sputtering of oil quieted and the meatballs browned. Lunatya turned them, and the crackle of hot oil rekindled. Luffy rested his head on the side of the basket, sticking his nose out. His eyes still closed, he twitched his nose and smacked his lips. With a pair of oven mitts, Lunatya picked up the pot and poured the hot oil into a bowl to cool. With the bowl put aside, she placed the pot back on the stove and splashed some wine into it. With a hiss of evaporation, a burst of steam and aroma was released. It was floral and fruity, rich enough to make the mouth water. Lunatya stirred the pot, scraping away at the fond, now soft from the wine. The browned bits melded with the liquid, forming the foundation of the sauce as it took on a deep, caramelized color. A touch of thyme, a pinch of pepper, and a sprinkle of salt, with a generous pour of stock to cover the meatballs and vegetables added in. Brought the pot to boil, covered it, and lowered the fire to a gentle ember. "Phew, all done," said Lunatya, wiping her brow. "Now I'll go soak the rice and everything will be good to go. Are you being a good boy, Luffy?" Lunatya took a peek inside the basket and found Luffy to be sleeping, nose still poking out. She giggled to herself, then went to fill a pot with some rice, leaving Luffy to enjoy his nap. With a slight nip of cool water, she swirled the pot round and round under the faucet, sifting her fingers through the delicate grains. The water took on a slurry of starch, making it a cloudy white. A tip to the side and a splash, then she filled the pot again with fresh water. She repeated the process a few times, humming to herself a soft tune, swaying side to side. The kitchen had a warmth to it that it hadn't had for quite a while, and she felt a lightness in her heart. She wanted this meal to bring a smile to everyone, and this tender compassion found its way into the food she prepared. The rice she washed was like ivory white pearls in glistening clear water. The stew was slowly cooking, the meatballs becoming more and more tender, the sauce growing richer in flavor. She felt it in her heart. This was going to be a good meal. Turning around and making her way back to the stove, there was a particular furry shadow hovering over the bowl sat next to the stove. Luffy was licking the bowl, and when he noticed Lunatya's gaze, he stopped for a moment. He looked at her, smacked his lips, licking them clean. They stared at each other for a moment. And Luffy went back to enjoying the rendered fat, lemming it up. "Luffy," she cried, "what are you doing, silly Fuffy?" He scurried over and placed the pot on the stove before inspecting what Luffy had done. Luffy sat down and smacked his lips some more, quite content with his little snack. Lunatya checked the bowl and found it to be nearly empty. There wasn't a lot of fat in there to begin with, though Luffy had licked most of it up. "Goodness, it looks like you quite enjoyed that," said Lunatya, letting out a sigh. "Maybe that's why your fur is so soft. I'll have to keep my eye out on you. I don't want you getting fat." "Meow," said Luffy, looking like a content child with food on his face. Luffy walked over to Lunatya holding the bowl and raised his head to look inside of it. He looked up at her with his big round eyes, holding his paws close to his chest. "You're lucky you're so cute. I suppose it's all right, you little fatty," said Lunatya. "You can finish the rest, though this is just a treat. You need to eat well so you stay healthy and can keep running around. I don't need a little furry elephant knocking over everything." With that said, she placed the bowl back in front of Luffy, who lemmed up the rest of the oil with great enjoyment. After finishing his snack, Luffy licked his lips, savoring the wonderful flavor. Luffy let out a happy little mew, then trotted his way to his basket like a little horse. Climbing in one furry paw at a time, he curled up on the pile of soft towels and let his heavy eyes flutter shut. Lunatya smiled and placed a hand on her chest. Luffy is a very good boy, she thought. Good kitties deserve good food. So she set out to start Luffy's dinner. Turning a dial on the oven inlaid into the wall, the flames came alight. The interior was filled with a soft orange glow as the flames flickered to and fro. Lunatya traced her way back to the stove, filled a small pot with Luffy's special carrot slices, along with some small bits of sweet potato. With a splash of water, she flicked on the stove with a whoosh and set the veggies to steam. She looked over at Luffy. He had placed his small paws over his eyes, covering them from the light. His arms were rolled over his head, his 2 furry ears poking out from behind his paws. The cuteness was overwhelming. Lunatya placed the back of her hand on her forehead and the other on her chest, swooning from the immense power. After chuckling to herself for a moment, she crept over, tiptoeing, and closed the curtain of the basket. Finishing up in the kitchen, she made haste to join Nixie in the cafe and enjoy the wonders of a sleeping furry loaf. With utmost care, she brought the delicate basket into the cafe, placing a single finger over her lips as she looked at Nixia, and then peeked the curtain open for her to look. She too swooned, facing power overwhelming. Lunatya placed the basket on one of the tables with the reverence of a holy offering and settled into the booth. She gazed out the window and shivered. It looked cold and dark. The snow was beautiful, but also fierce, swirling violently in the wind as it flickered in the light of the lanterns outside. It was quite the show to watch as they waited in their warm shelter as their dinner cooked. Oh, it would not be long until a cloaked figure would enter, bearing news from beyond the warm and quiet cafe.